My name is Paul Pope. I am a professor here at the LBJ School and a senior fellow in the Intelligence Studies Project, which is supported very strongly by the Strauss Center, who are our hosts today, and the Brumley Fellows, many of whom are in the room. So I was asked to secure a speaker for the Brumley Fellows and for an occasion like this. And I asked an old friend, Peter Clement, who I've known from CIA for years, to come join us. Peter's now at Columbia, but I'm going to let Mauro Youssef introduce Peter. Mauro is a PhD candidate in sociology here and a Brumley Fellow. She has spent extensive time overseas. She's doing some interesting research now on civil societies in Tunisia. And she's a veteran of not only State Department, but INR, the State Department Intel organization. So, Mauro, would you mind coming and introducing our guest speaker?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Clement. He is a former high-level senior official in the analysis side of CIA, and he's currently a professor of international affairs and a Russia expert at Columbia University. Thank you.
Well, first let me say thank you for having me. I'm delighted, and when Paul first called me up, I was thrilled. It's a great honor to be asked to speak at the Strauss Center and to meet with a lot of the Brumley Fellows who are here. I've been actually out here a few times before. Sometimes we go to the LBJ library, which I love. So it's always a pleasure to be here, so thanks for having me today. The topic today is Russia and the Middle East is more than Syria. I need to put the mic on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I feel like the Verizon guy. Who now I guess works for an opposing telecommunications company. He's gotten old too, those ads are really old. At any rate, since most everything you read lately having to do with the Middle East has something to do with Syria, I thought when talking about what the Russians are up to, I'll talk a little bit about Syria, but the title here is really about what else is going on. What are the Russians doing besides just being directly involved militarily in Syria? Because to me, I think it says a whole lot about what their broader strategic thinking is about the region and what their goals might be. So I'm going to do the classic Intel approach to a briefing. I'm going to give you the bottom line up front. There's an acronym for that. We call it the BLUF. I'm sure you've probably all heard of it, those of you who are students. So let me do the BLUF quickly. I'll quickly run through what's going on in Syria, but then the main part of the comments will be about what they're doing elsewhere in the Middle East and what that might tell us about their broader strategic goals in the region. So my argument basically is that there's a number of diverse goals that underlie Russia's policy calculus when they think about the Middle East. One of them is they want to develop an extensive set of energy relationships with a number of states in the region. They want to expand an increasingly important part of their revenue from arms sales. They have a lot of customers and clients in the region. And then thirdly, for good, solid geopolitical reasons, there's a lot of other countries besides Syria. There are a lot of important bilateral relationships that they seek to sustain and expand in some cases because it fits some broader goal they have. And generally that goal has something to do with this. There's a famous quote from Andrei Gromyko, a long time old, now deceased Soviet foreign minister, but there's a famous phrase he used about the Soviet Union has become so significant in the world that there are no major international issues that can be resolved without Soviet involvement. My personal view is I think that's very much where Mr. Putin is, that he wants to be sure, particularly in the Middle East, but I would say on most key international issues, they want to be sure that they have a voice that has to be heard. So that's my bottom line. Let me quickly try to dispense with Syria. Although there's so much here, I'll quickly run through Syria, but in the Q&A, if you have any other questions or comments, observations about what's going on in Syria, I'm happy to take those on as well, because I know that's a big issue that has a lot of policy implications for the U.S. as well. So to briefly sum up, if you look at where the Russians are right now in Syria, since the September 2015 intervention, they've made pretty significant gains at a relatively low cost. And that's a really important thing here, the low cost part. If you look at specifics, they've had relatively few casualties. They've gained a major foothold in a military strategic sense. They gained from Assad as, I think, kind of repayment for a lot of what they've done for him, the 49-year lease on the facility in Tartus. They've also gained access to an airfield in Hmenim, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. It's very hard to spell. Mauro, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
John can correct you.
It's Hmemiem. It's, anyway, it's a significant airfield which the Russians did not have prior to this intervention. But there are other things that they've benefited from, and one of the most important is they have used the Syrian civil war as essentially a test bed for new weapons that they have developed that didn't actually have wartime experience. It's very different when you test things as opposed to actually using them, seeing if they work effectively. So that's another big benefit from the Russian military perspective. Another aspect that's been important to the military is with roughly 5,000 or so personnel on the ground, mostly at this airfield in Tartus, by the way, not fighting ground force activity. But they rotate these people in and out every several months. So basically, in addition to the test bed for your equipment, you're also getting a lot of your military officers and grunts field real wartime experience, which is also is very important, I think, for most military leaders, that you have some actual recent experience. So basically, by virtue of this significant intervention, they have solidified and actually expanded and built on what's essentially a 50-year relationship with Syria. You can go back into history and look. They have had a long-term relationship, and most experts, I think, would argue that Syria has essentially been their foothold in the region. I would say that foothold is significantly bigger now than it was before this intervention. So as I said before, I'm happy to go to questions if you want to talk more about that in the Q&A. To get to the issue about other things they're doing in the Middle East. So basically, I'll divide this up into two parts. There are what I call significant domestic economic drivers to what they're doing in the Middle East, and then also domestic political drivers. So on the economic side, first, energy calculations. If you know anything about the way the Russians do their budget planning, you know how we have our problems in the United States with continuing resolutions and fighting about our budget. The Russians probably have a less complicated system. Every year they come up with a budget plan. And the fundamental building block of the budget plan is, what's the price of oil? So they literally build a budget around, are we looking at $50 a barrel oil, $60 a barrel oil, $70 or less? And they basically built everything around what the projected price of oil will be in the coming year. That tells me the price of oil is probably pretty significant. If that's true, it starts to explain in large part why the Russians are doing so many things with other energy producers in the Middle East. And high on that list is Saudi Arabia. One of the most fascinating recent developments is, particularly for a long time Soviet era watcher like myself, generally the Soviet Union and the Saudis don't like each other. The Saudis have been always suspicious. There's been great enmity. They worry about a regime that looks to destabilize their country. They don't like communism. Not that that's an issue per se anymore with Russia. But this has not been a typically friendly relationship. But in the recent past, they've actually interacted a lot more. And particularly last October, King Salman went, for the first time ever, a Saudi king went to Moscow. And I think for an old Russian, I thought this was like a huge, huge deal. This is highly unusual. And among the things they talked about were oil, price of energy, and also different investments that Russia might make in the energy sectors of Saudi Arabia. So here, things I would point to are the multiple talks that have occurred not only during the visit to Moscow, but subsequently between high-level Russian and Saudi oil officials. They reached general agreement on the need to work together both OPEC and non-OPEC players to basically stabilize oil prices in the world, which is something the Saudis have had some success in doing in the recent past. This obviously helps the Russians. In terms of multiple interests here, if you're the king in Saudi Arabia and the crown prince, who is now the number 2 in waiting, although he seems to act like the king. Did anybody see the piece on 60 Minutes?
Yeah.
The interview, which was absolutely fascinating. He's got pretty radical ideas. So for him, having a stable oil market is actually pretty important right now. He's talking about radical things like maybe privatizing part of Saudi Aramco. That would be huge, quite apart from all the other social reforms that he's talking about quite publicly. So he has a strong interest in having a more predictable energy price situation in the world. For Putin, obviously, for reasons I mentioned about the budget. But I'd also say, if you look beyond Saudi Arabia, I'm struck at just the vast number of countries with whom Russia is moving to sign new deals, either in research and development, building pipelines, exploring and selling not only oil and gas, but liquefied natural gas. So there's a whole series of arrangements that the Russians are doing with a variety of countries, which in my mind get to this bigger strategy, that somehow they have a much bigger strategy. So to eliminate any suspense, my view of the strategy is, since the Russians recognize they have a mono economy that's very heavily dependent on revenues from the sale of oil and gas, they want to insulate themselves from all the ups and downs in the global energy markets. One way to do that, instead of just depending on your export of energy, what if you have all these relationships with a number of countries and you suddenly get part ownership or a stake in pipeline development, research and development, exploration and exploitation in those countries, so that you're not only tethered to your own domestic production, but you're now built in basically to a more global system of energy production, transportation, and export of a variety of countries. Because the bottom line is there will always be a need for energy. Even if the prices go up and down, there will always be a certain continuity of requirements for energy around the world. And the more markets you're involved in with all these other states, that makes you a little less dependent on solely your export of oil and gas. So I could rattle off a bunch of things. I will do this briefly, but I started looking around over the last 2 to 3 years. Here are some of the deals that I would highlight. Putin went to Iran in November of 2017, and as a result of the visit, Gazprom and Rosneft, 2 of the major energy producers in Russia, signed major deals, 6 different energy cooperation deals with Iran, valued at $30 billion, reportedly. This also got them involved in exploration and R&D for untapped fields in Iran. So that tells me this is more than just selling, it's also the production and the exploitation and extraction piece. There was an agreement signed in November 2017 with the Kurds. And if you think about that for a minute, that's pretty out there. The Kurds are not an independent country, the last I heard. They did have a referendum. And one of the fascinating things, I was struck that the Russians were prepared to talk and sign deals with the KRG, the Kurdish regional government, that actually wasn't a country. It's part of Iraq, with whom Russia also has relations. So that was, to me, a big move that had some risk to it. But they did it anyway, which again says they must really be interested in exploiting any potential new source that they can become a part owner in, as they did with the Kurds. Turkey, there was a major deal signed in October 2016 for the Turk Stream pipeline, which would go under the Black Sea. Again, this gets to the transport piece. How does all this stuff get moved around? So if you own a piece of that, you're going to get a percentage of something when that comes online and you have the sales resulting from that. Egypt, in October 2017, Rosneft paid an Italian energy firm, ENI, they're reporting $1.1 billion for a 30% stake in Egypt's Zohr gas field near the Mediterranean. So as I started looking at all this, I thought, wow, this is far more than I had actually thought, because you generally think about Iran, maybe Iraq. But as I looked, I mean, I am going to keep going. The Palestinians, in 2014, Putin talked about a possible deal between Gazprom and the Palestinians about offshore fields, gas fields, off Gaza. And I thought, wow, talk about pushing the envelope. This is definitely not a country, but they have a claim to certain resources in that area, and they're already thinking, how could we tap into that? Similarly, here's an oddball one, Israel. In the case of Israel, Putin talked about a possible deal buying into the Israeli development of the Leviathan gas fields, which have yet to come to fruition. But again, kind of an unusual trade partner in energy for the Russians. And then finally you have Syria. There have been a fair number of reports, I can't say they've all been substantiated, but there are reports that the Russians have basically reached understandings with the Syrian government that those areas that they secure and liberate from either ISIS or from the Syrian Defense Forces, those areas where there are oil or gas resources, that the Russians will actually claim some degree of ownership, not clear how much. That basically, I'm thinking, this is one way the Russians are trying to offset their costs. They have spent some money, of course, between the 5,000 people on the ground, the military armaments, the ordnance that's been dropped, all the flights and so on. They spent a little bit of money. It's not breaking the bank or anything, but if you can recoup and have a long-term stake in some of these other resources in Syria, so much the better. Incidentally, this is a source of some contention because the Iranians have the same problem. The Iranians also assert in different media that they have understandings with the Syrian government for those areas that they either liberate and or provide protection to, that they would have some stake in the output of various energy fields. So you have, and of course the Iranians, as I'm sure you all know, they have a much bigger stake in terms of on-the-ground combatants, either their own forces, militias that they support from Iraq, and also Hezbollah. So they have a much bigger piece of the really dirty part of the fighting on the ground than Russian aircraft dropping ordnance. Another big piece of this energy strategy that I envision here, I'm also struck by the number of countries with whom Russia has reached agreements to either build or is in the process of planning for building is nuclear reactors, nuclear power. In fact, ironically, in this morning's media, Mr. Putin is in Turkey today, and he's there for a groundbreaking of a nuclear reactor that was agreed to back in, I think, in the fall of 2016, but now it's actually, they're doing the groundbreaking, so they're going to build this as a source of energy inside Turkey. To me, that highlighted perfectly one of these points I'm arguing for. The other thing that's happening in Turkey tomorrow, Mr. Rouhani from Iran will be there to meet with Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan, and they're going to talk about, guess what, Syria. So they have very strong stakes. In some cases, they have competing and conflicting interests. So I think the fact that they're all getting together now to try to talk about the way ahead and how they hopefully can bring this war to an end, it's significant that they do meet at that level. Other states with whom Russia has signed agreements relating to nuclear energy, I mentioned the one in Turkey. There was also one with Jordan. There was an agreement with Egypt. And the other interesting one is a huge new deal that people are holding their breath about involving Saudi Arabia. And the reason I'm intrigued by this is the Saudis basically have announced they are going to have nuclear energy. They want to build several reactors. The question is who will provide the services to help build? And they're essentially having kind of a bidding war, if you will, and guess who two of the biggest bidders are? The United States and Russia, among others. In fact, Secretary of Energy Perry was in London, and I think this was maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, to meet with the Saudis, and this was reportedly the issue they were talking about. The Russians, for their part, have also been having conversations, and it's not clear yet which way the Saudis are going to go on this decision. But what is clear is any contract with the U.S. have complications, because we generally put on conditions about what's going to be done with the spent fuel. The Russians, on the other hand, seem to have no compunctions about these kinds of issues, and I think that puts them potentially in a very strong bidding position, although you never know. I mean, geopolitics may actually prove to be the trump card, no pun intended, in this bidding process. We'll see what happens in terms of Saudi decision-making. So in terms of the point of all these energy relationships, I think you can make a strong argument that Russia's taking a very long-term strategic view, not only for the sale of their resources at home, but also to get deeply, deeply enmeshed in various pipelines, construction, and export of energy reserves across the Middle East. Now, the other big economic driver for Russia has to do with arms sales. And I have way too many here, I'll just hit some of the highlights, but as you know, the Russians are pretty active in the arms market, although you may also know who the single biggest arms exporter in the world is. I'm guessing we all know the answer to that. So I don't want to be too hostile in my comments about the Russians. The U.S. obviously is the major one, but there's a pretty lively market out there, especially in the Middle East, especially since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. But again, I'm struck, I will make one or two quick geopolitical points. The thing I'm most struck by when I look at the various deals the Russians have signed is two of the major buyers of Russian arms these days are Iraq and Egypt. And if you think back 5 or 10 years, they generally were considered as countries with whom the United States had very close relations, or the U.S. was firmly entrenched in Iraq for some time. So we were in a pretty strong position, and yet now the Russians seem to be making inroads with countries with whom we had these traditionally strong or high presence kinds of relationships. Just to give a couple of examples, major new arms deals have been signed in the last 3 or 4 years with Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia, and of course with Syria. A couple of supporting data points. In Iraq, in 2012, Baghdad contracted for $4.2 billion of Russian attack helicopters and SA-22 air defense systems. In July 2017, a little more recent, Iraqi Vice President Maliki was in Moscow, and they talked about a possible deal for a large number of T-80 Russian-made tanks to exceed $1 billion in cost. In Iran, the single biggest deal there is the S-300 air defense system that the U.S. had been pressing the Russians since I was an analyst, since the mid-90s. This has been a contentious issue in our relationship, and finally, just a few years ago, the Russians said, we're done with all this, we are going to sell it. And now they're actually in the implementation phase. This is a deal worth about $8 billion for the Russians. Turkey, there's another interesting paradox. So Turkey, which is a NATO member, supposedly a close friend of the United States, signs a major arms deal with the Russians. And this is also intriguing for the S-400, a more advanced air defense system than the S-300. So I'm thinking, so the Turks are going to get a more advanced system than the Iranians have, although the Iranians, in my view, tend to be closer partners with the Russians than, say, the Turks. So this is a very unpredictable world, and I'm always a little surprised at some of the things you get to see here. One of the issues here with this air defense system in Turkey, of course, is it's not compatible with NATO systems. So this raises a whole host of other issues as to why are the Turks doing this. We can do this in the Q&A if you want. I won't go into it now, but the whole Turkish-Russian relationship is another fascinating source of political analysis for a lot of observers. In Egypt, there was a major deal signed in 2015, $5 billion involving M29 MiGs. And also long-range air defense systems. Algeria fighter aircraft, they ordered 12 Su-34s in 2016, and there were rumors that the United Arab Emirates is also talking about purchasing Su-35 advanced fighter aircraft. And then finally there's the Saudis, and this is another one that always amazes me in some ways. The Saudis are also looking to buy the S-400 advanced air defense system. Now, of course, they have a need. If anybody's been following what's been going on with Yemen and these various, we've had more than a few missile attacks now, so I think they're eager to get whatever they can in terms of anti-missile systems from the Russians. One final footnote on the arms piece. Sometimes, and these are unsubstantiated, but I've seen reports that in dealing, say, with the Saudis, one of the issues the Russians would like to advance, or one of their goals here is they'd like port access in Yemen. So if the Saudis can find a way to reach some kind of a settlement in Yemen, the Russians would like some kind of guaranteed access to aid. And we can date this back to the Soviet period of the 80s, but this was always an interesting relationship given where it's the geography along the Red Sea. Egypt, if you've been following Egypt at all, there have been many reports about the Russians utilizing air access, in part for work that's being done by the Egyptians in Libya. And I've seen other reports of where the Russians are also trying to get more institutionalized, by agreement, access to various Egyptian ports. These seem to be not only economic in nature, but obviously geopolitical. So quickly, let me go to the non-economic factors in terms of Russian policy calculus here. This would be on the domestic political front. So the first is, and I think Putin makes a strong argument, a big reason why they're involved in the Syrian civil war has to do with countering terrorism. And if you read, Putin gave a strong interview several months ago where he said the main reason we went into Syria was, I want to kill the terrorists there before they come here. And I think that's a bona fide argument that he could make. They've certainly had their experiences with a number of horrific terrorist events in Russia. You might also remember that the way that Putin strengthened his position to get elected president the first time, when he was named prime minister by Yeltsin in the summer of 1999, there was a series of apartment bombings, which were pretty horrible, which are very controversial, by the way, about who was behind the bombings. That's a whole class unto itself. Nonetheless, Putin, as the newly named prime minister, said, this is intolerable. We need to act with great force, and we need to go to the source. And we all know where the source is. They're coming out of Chechnya. And if you think about it, that was a huge decision, because Chechnya, there had been previous wars in 1994 and 96, and they were not pretty. And the Russians did not avail themselves very well in the conduct of that war. In fact, it was really a significant embarrassment for Yeltsin himself how poor that war was run. So here, as he's getting ready to run, he hasn't been named yet, and it's not clear when Yeltsin told him, but he's the new prime minister. The conventional wisdom at the time was the prime minister generally could be next in line, because if Yeltsin dropped dead tomorrow, the prime minister is the acting president. So Putin's got to be thinking, if I have a future here, this is a make or break issue for me. He decides to go to war in Chechnya. And that's pretty risky. And he did it, and he did it fairly successfully. It was ugly, it was a little while, basically securing the area and bringing Mr. Kadyrov into a strongman position in Chechnya. But he succeeded, not without a fair number of casualties and great devastation in Chechnya. But that's how he basically catapulted himself into a big national profile and got himself elected. So here, you have a situation now where you potentially, and they've had a fair number of terrorists from the Middle East who find their way back to Russia. So Putin actually gave numbers. He said, we've calculated there are 4,000 Russians in the war in Syria, fighting on behalf of ISIS and other terrorist groups. And by the way, there's 9,000 other people from Central Asia, part of the former Soviet Union, if you will, who are also in that war. So the potential for some of these people actually coming home to wreak havoc and terrorize people is fairly high. So that's the reason we went into Syria. Second reason Putin has a domestic driver in his calculations is, quite apart from the concern about terrorism, he's also worried about his public approval ratings. So when you make a decision to go into Syria, this is why you want to keep the casualties low, the costs low, and you want to minimize any negative publicity that might come out of what you're doing there. Of course, when you manage the press for the most part, it's a lot easier to do that. But nonetheless, word gets out. If there were to be huge numbers of casualties, people would hear about this, in part because of social media, in part because the families of all the deceased are going to be talking to each other, and people just hear. So I think they've been very, very careful to portray a narrative that shows this is relatively low cost. We haven't lost very many people. In fact, it's barely double digits, in double digits. Now, there was an episode that occurred in February where there was an encounter between, now reportedly, between Russian forces on the east side of the Euphrates River we had an encounter with U.S. forces, and the U.S. forces employed significant artillery, air power, and artillery shells to take out a large number of hostile forces who had come across the river to attack Syrian defense forces. And the rumors that first came out were that there were maybe 400 to 500 Russians who died in this encounter. If you follow this closely and do a lot of digging, that was a greatly exaggerated number. What is clear, though, is that they were not Russian, quote-unquote, forces. They were mercenaries. There's a group called the Wagner Group, which is owned by a gentleman named Prigozhin, who's a very close friend, so-called Putin's kitchen cook. He has a culinary instinct. So if you think about this for a minute, what this provides Putin, whether or not he ordered it or whether the military is in cahoots with these so-called mercenaries, it provides them a deniability of some degree, and you don't get to count them. So when you're talking about actual military losses, oh, those are just like mercenaries. Those aren't our guys, they aren't our soldiers. So if you're working to keep those numbers down, because you do worry about that in terms of public opinion, this is a very convenient device, if you will. Incidentally, some of these Wagner people were also involved in East Ukraine. So the idea that they're mercenaries is actually pretty correct. The question is, how much of this is done in complete collaboration, or maybe in the direction of the government in Moscow? And that's one of the million-dollar questions that we can't completely answer at this point, especially me, since I'm not ready to anything anymore. That was supposed to be a laugh line. One of the things I used to have to do when I would do these talks at the beginning, I would say, all of my views are mine and only mine and not those of the agency, and by the way, everything's completely unclassified, and it actually is all unclassified. I've thoroughly sourced every comment here with footnotes, and I sent it to the Publication Review Board, because it's a lifelong commitment you make when you join the agency. Paul knows all about this. I know. Anyway, I'm pretty thorough about finding all my sources for things. So my final concluding point, I wanted to avoid the perception that this sounds like one of those briefings where I'm yelling, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Did anybody ever see that movie? It's a 1960s movie. Thank you. I love that movie. It's a great movie, but it highlighted some of the incredibly paranoid fears the American public had about the Russians. But sometimes when you do these briefings, it's, oh my God, the Russians are taking over the world. There's a new variation of this. If you watch what's going on with Russia and China in Africa, if you read the media, there's an awful lot of that, oh my gosh, they're coming again. It's like the 70s and 80s when the Soviets were in the third world. They're establishing bases, they're supplying arms, they're developing military assistance relationships with a number of African states, and it looks like they're much more active and assertive. My corrective to that, I mean, there's no question there have been some real gains, both on the geopolitical and economic side. But the flip side of this, especially when you're talking about the Middle East, this is probably the most unstable and unpredictable region in the world, in my view. And I say this because my conceptual thinking about the Middle East is, this is a very complex, multi-dimensional chessboard. In my view, there's at least 6 different chess games going on simultaneously if you look at the Middle East. For the Middle East fans, you probably know where I'm going here. So the first one would be, well, there's this chess game going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Okay, who's going to be the original big dog or hegemon, if you will, in the region? And they're pretty open about it. If you wonder what's going on in Yemen, it's not really about Yemen. It's about Saudi Arabia and Iran. Some could argue there's a big element of that in Syria, of course, what's going on here between the Shia militias, Iran funding some Iranian forces, and Hezbollah, which is closely affiliated with Iran. Why are they doing all this battleground fighting on behalf of Mr. Assad and all of that? So that's a very big chessboard. There's another one that I think of, and it has to do with Egypt. And not many people think of Egypt this way, but if you ever go to Egypt and talk to Egyptians, I don't know, you could tell me all about this moral. My perception is, you talk to senior Egyptians and they think like, we're the big dog. We are arguably the most populous Arab state in the Middle East. We have a long history. We've been a great power for many, many times at different points in our recent history. And as far as we're concerned, we're struggling also with the Saudis in a sense to be the acknowledged leader, if you will, in the Arab world. I throw Turkey in this now. They're not Arab, but if you don't think Erdogan has his own little agenda, I don't want to call it restoring the Ottoman Empire, but there are elements of big empire-like thinking in some of the comments he makes about the role and influence they should be playing, not only in this region, but also in Central Asia. Then there's the old standard. There is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which has many tentacles in many of the other parts of the Middle East in terms of who supports them or who doesn't support them. As of late, the Palestinians are not getting a lot of love and happiness from their former big power Arab clients for a number of reasons, one of which is Syria. Although there is a spillover here because the Israelis have become more active in taking out suspected missile sites and missile factories run by Hezbollah a little too close to the border in the Golan Heights. So I'm just struck at kind of the overlap of some of these chessboards here. Then there's another chessboard. There's the great power chessboard of external players, be it Russia, the United States in particular. The Europeans have a big stake in this because they have been so dramatically affected by what's happening in Syria and the mass exodus of refugees who've actually changed the political dynamic in many European countries, which I don't think everybody fully understood when this started, the civil war. But now I think it's indisputable. Incidentally, it's one reason I would argue people are talking about how's Syria going to be rebuilt, who's going to pay for it. I think Mr. Putin's thought on this is, well, I know somebody who might want to pay for this. If we can convince the Europeans that we, the Russians, had a hand in resolving this conflict, ending the war, and helping all those refugees come back from Europe, would you not think the Europeans would be happy to contribute to a rebuilding of Syria? And they have to overcome a lot of their moral qualms about, oh my gosh, we're going to help Mr. Assad, the man who actually created this horrific war in rebuilding his own country. It's just a theory I have, but I think it's something worth thinking about. So bottom line here, whoever decides they want to play a role in the Middle East, be it Russia, the United States, or the Europeans, you need to be mindful of all these different chessboards that are at play. And my final point is, when I think about, on any given day, how I look at the Middle East, it's like looking through a kaleidoscope. On any given day, if one big event happens, like say the Arab Spring, or the rise of the civil war in Syria, it alters everything, the landscape, the relationships, the angles at which people look through this prism in the kaleidoscope as to how to think about the problem. It's just one of the most complicated places where everything is kind of interrelated, and injecting yourself in the middle of that is not easy. The Russians are wrestling with this because they've made some gains in Syria, but they also have to maintain a relationship with Turkey, with Iran, and we're already beginning to see some tensions there, with Jordan to some degree, with the Saudis who clearly are supporting the Sunnis in the civil war. So it's not a simple little, we're going to go in there and show that we can change the course of a war. To me, that's, I don't want to say the easy part, but the end game of this is going to be way more complicated than the fighting part. So let me stop there and we can go to Q&A. Yes, Diana.
Just following up, first of all, thank you very much, Peter. This is fascinating. But I'd like to follow up a little bit on your very last point. With all the different initiatives and strategies, etc., what of this is keeping Putin up at night? What is his main risk or downside?
That's a great question. And actually, it's a question that I asked my students in their last memo last week. There was a great piece by Neil McFarquhar in the New York Times about 3 weeks ago, and the title was Russia's biggest problem in Syria is their friend, Mr. Assad. I think the risk they run, this could be a prolonged war. I'm not entirely convinced that once they move everybody out of East Ghouta and then presumably do a horrific final act in Idlib. First of all, Idlib is big. You're going to kill a lot of people, and I think that will resonate more broadly around the world, they're going to get a lot more criticism. I don't know that anybody will actually do anything, but the impact there, I think, will be significant. So even if they can prevail there, the odds of greater casualties, that some planes may be taken out, that there may be some fallout they haven't fully anticipated, that's a risk. And then there's the reconstruction part. I mean, my thesis about how they might rebuild, well, that's the good news thesis for Putin if he can pull it off. I'm not at all convinced that they can find a political settlement. I think I can see a prolonged process where maybe the war, quote unquote, ends, but you have endless numbers of terrorist events, and there are going to be very large chunks of the country which are really not secure. So then the question is Syria really at peace, and is it still one country? We've had some analysts, and I'm very open to the possibility that Syria will never be Syria again. That you could see a partially autonomous Kurdish region, maybe a section that's carved out for a predominantly Sunni community in the north. Although I don't know, then you have to give up Aleppo, don't you? There's some, I don't know how you resolve it. I don't see what the negotiated solution is here, because then you'd have to create a police state even worse than the one they had, where you try to keep everybody in check. I don't know that that's possible anymore, unless Assad's gone, and that everybody says, well, we can't have that now. I think the Russians actually, they would like an outcome where they can get him to move along, but they have so much invested in him right now. It's really, really hard for them to move him. There were multiple points in the last few years where I believe the Russians were genuinely trying to promote a negotiation process that actually involved real opposition members, not Al-Qaeda people, but maybe Ansar al-Sham, I don't know. Some people who were not just the stooges, the so-called opposition that Assad touts says, oh, I have real opposition. If you have a real process going that involves the other players and stakeholders, I don't know how Assad can, all of his behavior so far is that he won't compromise his one iota. I think his solution is the military one. And because the Russians have invested so much so far, they don't seem to say no. This is a debate that we were having for some time. Are the Russians genuinely pursuing a diplomatic solution? And I think in their heart of hearts, that's what they like. It's not that they love Assad personally. They want a pro-Russian regime with whom they can maintain the access and influence they've enjoyed. But I think even they understand Assad he's a losing quantity in any kind of a solution. But right now they're stuck with him. So that was the point of the Times article. To me, this is a big risk. I don't know that you can resolve this diplomatically if he's still there. Sir?
I want to ask two questions, but one about scale. You talked a lot about the defense, the weapon systems that the Russians are selling in the Middle East in terms of some way to compare. How does that compare with what the U.S. is doing? Are they equal, or is it 10% of the U.S.? I mean, how do we understand the significance?
Yeah, that's a really fair question, and I don't have precise data. I should have anticipated that. That's a great question.
Okay.
So if I were doing a briefing at the White House, I should have taken notes on my background. I did look up, in terms of global sales, the U.S., I think it's at least 3 or 4 or 5 times more than the Russians. But different regions of the world, the proportions differ.
And what about the investments they're making in Middle East energy? How does that compare with the investments that we're making?
That's another good one. I don't have the answer to that. That's a great question.
Okay,
I
so
will do my homework on that.
maybe I'll ask one you should get. Hopefully.
Yeah.
What is the attitude of the Chinese to the effort that Russia is making in the Middle East? It seems to me the Chinese would be much more threatened by not having availability of energy compared to us or compared to anybody else, because they are very much dependent on those sources.
I totally agreed, and I think actually that's a whole separate talk, but I think if I were to do the research, I know a little bit about this. I know the Russians have invested and signed LNG deals with some of the Gulf states. I think it's a UAE, I'm not positive. But I think they very much, and similarly in Africa in terms of certain minerals and so on, they are definitely strategically locating their investments and their presence, particularly to meet their energy needs. I don't know the actual numbers, but that's another good question to look into. Lauren?
Going off the arms sales question, we saw during the Cold War that a lot of these Middle Eastern and North African countries were buying from both the Russians or the Soviet Union and the US and cooperating with those. So this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. So what, do you think that they're signaling anything right now? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, I know Algeria has been a longtime partner of Russia, but do you think these very close US allies are trying to gesture or signal to the US that they don't have to fully rely on them, or is there a message?
I'd say it's possibly a message, but I think in looking back at throughout the Cold War, I think a lot of third world governments in particular, they've all figured out, if I can be milking both parties, why wouldn't I? If they want to have their competition, that's great, but if I can benefit from both, and I do think there's definitely an element to that in both. Turkey's a different case. I think in Turkey's case, I think there is something going on. It's not just because he wants to milk both sides. He's taking some big risks in taking on the S-400s from the Russians, and also just generally having a more positive relationship. For example, in the recent expulsion of Russian diplomats by the EU in response, not that Turkey's in the EU, they're not, but Turkey made a point of saying publicly, well, we don't like what happened, we think it's terrible, people are being poisoned, but they didn't name the Russian government, and they've been very, very nice in the way they've treated Russia. So I think that's another piece potentially to signal here. We're not in bed with all those other people in NATO who are criticizing and condemning the Russians. We have an important relationship with our own interests. Incidentally, UN votes are always a useful indicator when you're looking for the kind of the geopolitical thermometer on how things are going, the people who abstain and the people who don't join in. Cyprus and Greece didn't expel any Russian diplomats, which was also an interesting little, I think, a little indicator of kind of where they are. They don't want to be too far out in front against the Russians because they have important financial, very important financial interests in the Russians.
Yeah, you've done a marvelous job enlightening us to a very coherent strategy by Russia in the Middle East. The energy side, the bases, the domestic security, and being a power player, being a role player in any major decision taken on the geopolitical front. How would you describe a systematic policy adopted and carried out by the United States?
I had a feeling that's where you're going. So in the past, what I would say is we don't do policy at the agency. We actually don't. I mean, that's one of the things we don't do. We only analyze the foreign policies of other states. And now that I'm liberated and retired, to be honest, I always find that the U.S. policy part is the hardest piece, because for all the arguments I just said about that chessboard thing in the Middle East, they all apply to the U.S. There are no easy answers. The Syria thing, I mean, we could probably have an interesting debate even in this room. Many people criticize President Obama for not following through on the Assad's violation of the red line using chemical weapons, and why didn't we go in and bomb a few facilities or do something to show that that was unacceptable. I have to believe, at least, did you everybody read that long story about Obama in the Atlantic Monthly? Maybe this is 5 or 6 months before the end of his term. To me, that was the most revealing interview I've ever read in my life from a sitting president with a journalist. But he basically said, look, when I came in, I don't want to get sucked into all these wars. We just lived through Iraq. We're still in Afghanistan. I'm trying to reduce the numbers. I just see the Middle East and Syria in particular as like a vortex into which we would get sucked in, and then what are you going to do? You feel good for a day or two. You take out an airfield or maybe a defense ministry building. Okay, and then what do you do for an encore? What if they respond in some way and they shoot at US forces? Then are we going up the little escalation ladder? This is something I don't want to do. And he could then say, you know, with some justification, and by the way, it was the presence of US ships and the very threat is what forced the Russians to say, hey, wait a minute, we can't let that happen. They presumably leaned on Assad to get to this understanding and the deal on elimination of all their chemical weapons, which of course they didn't entirely eliminate. Or maybe they did and then they created new stocks afterwards. But I think he could claim with some credibility, you know, that there was some gain that was to be had. But others would have said, no, that was wrong. Had we taken more forceful action, maybe Assad would have listened and the Russians would have been less assertive. That's one of those counterfactuals that we're just not going to know. At the macro level, the question is, do you believe the U.S. should be playing a much greater role, kind of as the world policeman, and getting involved in places where we think horrible things are happening? And this is the extreme argument. Or the other extreme, the old Pat Buchanan argument that why is the U.S. getting involved in all these places? What interests are we really serving? Aren't they going to sell oil to us even if we don't go in there and protect the Saudis? I mean, they need to sell it. I mean, those are the two extreme arguments, but this is one reason why I'm glad I was never actually a policy maker. It's a lot easier to analyze foreign countries. But I do accept the notion that at this point in time, there's a perception that the U.S. is not prepared to act more forcefully in certain cases. And maybe that's the reason why we're seeing some of these states maneuver the way they are, like Turkey. I wouldn't rule that out, but I don't, you know, I can't have a strong definitive answer on that. I just don't know. Sorry, I don't mean to duck your question.
It's fine.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Jill Backer. I'm a student here at LBJ School. First, I just want to make a comment on the Turkey-Russia relations.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the current kind of very measured and not aggressive at all reaction to the attack in Britain has more to do with trying to rebuild Turkish-Russian relations after several years of it being increasingly tense. But that is a little bit inside. My question is something that I have noticed with Syria and Russian relations is that they, at least from my perspective, do not seem to have a very nuanced understanding of what's going on within the country. They tend to seem to, like Assad, treat the whole civil war as if it is one chess game, when in reality there's so many different rebel groups and so many, I mean, there's almost at least 3 major wars going on within the country. The Kurds and then the wider war in the north and then in the south. And I think that's part of what's held the United States back, is that in some ways we've been more nuanced with trying to figure out which rebel forces we support, which ones we don't, etc. I wonder though if, as Russia across the Middle East is doing these very macro political relations, do you think that they are like being short-sighted when it comes to the domestic issues in each of these countries, the way that they have been in Syria, or am I wrong about their like macro to micro level involvement in Syria to begin with?
It's a great question, and I'm inclined to agree with you. First, on the Turkey thing, I do think it's part of the rebuilding, although that rebuilding's been going on for a little while now, but I definitely think this is just another step in this strong attempt. I think Erdogan recognizes he's a little bit out on a limb in this war that he's fighting against the Kurds in Syria, which is hiding tensions with us, and I think it's important for him to make sure he has a more firm, solid relationship with the Russians, because they're another big stakeholder there, and can probably have an impact too with Assad, maybe. On the broader question, though, the dilemma for the Russians is when you side with somebody like Assad, and he gets to define what's the war that's going on, and the war is, it's me, the regime, against all the terrorists. How do you have a debate with the Russians on this? How do you explain that out of a population of roughly 23 million when the war started, that more than half of them have either fled the country, live abroad, or they're internally displaced persons. So according to Assad, every single one of those people basically is terrorists. And all the others are people who understand the right cause and they support the regime. Well, the Russians, by virtue of being a major military supporter now, they have to buy into the narrative. And Putin, they say that too. They use the same language. Basically, they're all terrorists, even though at some level, and we know this because of the attempted negotiations with some elements of the opposition, they understand that it is more complex. But at least in their public narrative, they can't really admit that. They put themselves in bed with Assad. And that's why I worry about Italy now. Frankly, I'm very worried about what we're going to see now. They've effectively found a way to move everybody out from the distant areas like Ghouta, for example, and if they're all concentrated in one large province, does that not make that province this huge bullseye on a big target board? And then we can see some massive bombing campaign for a prolonged period of time, which the Russians would have a major role in. And I'm interested to see if Putin's ready to do that, because I think that one probably will set even more of the world against him. Although you could argue, what have they got to lose? Pretty much all of Western Europe, or the Europeans for the most part, are already outraged at what he's doing not only there, but what just happened in Britain. He's already the victim of sanctions, or the target of significant sanctions. There could be more. The debate that's going on right now, if anybody saw the Bill Burns op-ed piece in the Times a few days ago, he's not alone, but more and more people now are saying, if you really want to inflict pain on the Russians, the limited targeted sanctions that we have on individuals right now is just not enough. What you need to do is go after all the money that a number of Russians have parked abroad. I actually like this issue a lot because, well, first of all, I think it's true. If you get that money and a huge number of the people in the Russian elite realize that where they squirrel their money abroad that they think is safe is now no longer safe, or they can't access it, that would inflict big pain. And I think Putin would be hearing a lot of outcry from his own elite supporters. The challenge, though, is the premise here is that there's a lot of people who are parking illegally got or corrupt, dirty money into the British economy. Have you thought about real estate in the United States? If we start applying that criterion level to everybody who bought condos in New York City, I'm very sensitive about this, living in New York, real estate's insane. And it's not just New York. There are a lot of major cities, and a lot of this money is foreign money, some of it from really nasty people who are very corrupt or dirty or criminals or drug money. And yet somehow we don't manage to really significantly enforce our laws on where all this money comes from. But we're going to apply it to the Russians, or the Brits might. I think the economic implications domestically for the Brits would be pretty significant. You might get the Russians the money, but then what about all the other people? Aren't people going to say, well, what about the others? I think you might have a similar debate in the U.S. as well. If we're serious about going after people with badly obtained funds or dirty money, why aren't we doing it equally to everybody? Maybe that would help our economy in the long run. I don't know whether it wouldn't. I can see real estate developers and bankers associations being outraged. You can't do this. It's going to hurt our business. To me, I'm fascinated with this as an issue because I think it could spark a much bigger debate about how money gets parked in foreign countries. So,
Isn't there a limit to what Russia can do financially and with their resources? I hear that their economy is not much bigger than Greece or Portugal.
that was in Putin's 2000 millennial speech. He talked about the fact that I think they ranked like 27, even Portugal was ahead of them. I think it's stronger than that, although it's not anywhere near the US, say, or China. And it has a lot of room for growth. I think the fundamental problem with the Russian economy is it's still, it's not a centralized command economy, but there are elements of it that are. The fact that the government has a stranglehold, for example, in the energy sector, and the fact that they aren't diversifying their economy to focus more on other manufactured goods to compete with other markets in the world. and the fact that they're, by virtue of their policies, they're discouraging pretty strongly any kind of foreign investment. That is an area where they're weak, where they need more assistance. But in terms of overall economic growth, they had a really bad patch from 2007, 2008 during the financial crisis to around, well, 2013, 2014. Then it was kind of flat. And more recently, it's picked up. In the last year, 2 years, they're back up to 1% to 2% growth in GDP. But it's not, I mean, even Putin acknowledged in his victory speech after the election, he is very open about the fact that they are still way behind and they have a long way to go. And he's asking people to bear with him that we can make this through this, and we're beginning to turn the corner a little, but we have a long, long way to go. So it's not a very strong economy, I would agree. Yes.
To your theory about having Europe financially support kind of the reconstruction of Syria, so it also seems like that influx of refugees and the political disruption it caused served his purposes pretty well.
Yes.
Globally. So how would you speak to that?
Yeah, one of the perhaps unintended benefits that the Russians have gained by virtue of this horrible war and the refugee exodus is that it's raised all these fundamental questions. Some people call it populism, but the response from the right and the more nationalist elements in many European countries to the point that it's created the kind of domestic political tensions that you're referring to. This is a big plus for them, of course. You could talk about Urban, you could talk about their attempts to affect the election in Germany or France. Less successful there, but other places, particularly in Central and Europe and the Balkans, I think, where they have a stronger position, they've seen real benefits. But the flip side is there's hardly any European investment coming anymore. They do have important relationships, especially with Germany, on the financial side. I think if this would serve multiple purposes. If they can take credit for effecting some kind of a negotiated settlement, and they can convince the Europeans, gee, we can start bringing back some of the refugees the Europeans might be able to hold them. But the other thing the Europeans might feel like is, why do we keep imposing these sanctions now on Russia, since they've done something very positive to help us deal with our domestic refugee problem? Now, that doesn't take care of the Crimea problem, but I think the Russians would hope that, gee, if we can soften them up a little bit, they would at least reduce, maybe in a big way, the current set of sanctions that they have. I don't think the Crimea thing will ever, they're never going to get that back. The Russians are extremely explicit about that. East Ukraine's a different issue. I think there's a possibility for some kind of a deal that would placate the Europeans. If I don't know if I answered your question.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I want to go back to two previous questions, and I want to ask you to put on your CIA hat, although you're not representing them officially, in regards to making a kind of a near-term call, like telling us, you've given us a lot of insight about the Middle East and the factors that are underway with Russia, but you mentioned Idlib a couple of times, and what I see happening there, and I want to ask you if this is what you see. I think you already said, a great humanitarian crisis if Assad pursues that. Because you got all manner of people crammed into this town, and so I think left unchecked by the Russians, he would want to pursue that and reduce that. The second thing, putting the U.S. in this game, and she asked the question about the way we play it compared to the way they play it. Well, one of the reasons we play it the way we played it is because the authorized use of military force only allows us to go after certain terrorist groups, so we had to define it that way, and that actually matters to the U.S. military. There's no way we could defend Idlib under the guise of going after ISIS.
Yeah.
So if we don't get out, we could be on the sideline as a humanitarian crisis is happening, and people are being slaughtered right under our noses, okay? If we stay, we're going to have to fight somebody other than ISIS. How do you see this playing out, Peter?
How would you get Congress to agree that we now have expanded our role, because now we actually are directly intervening in a civil war because we're not fighting ISIS?
Right.
I think that will be a really hard sell.
I do too.
But I do worry about it. I mean, I'm worried that we're potentially going to look at another huge humanitarian crisis. I'm reminded, remember why we got involved in Libya? That, in some ways, that was almost an easier one because Gaddafi was a singleton, as it were, right? You didn't have all these other actors directly involved, and NATO went in there, and lo and behold, Gaddafi was gone. Of course, look what we got. And this actually is part of Putin's argument, why he says you really need to, you all in the West need to understand, Assad can't go for now. You don't want Libya, do you? This is one of their biggest arguments. And the more recent argument, I recently had a Russian diplomat from the UN mission speak to my class, actually last week, which was very interesting. And he got a lot of hard questions. The students were great. They were polite, courteous, but also tough on the questioning. And they pushed on the Syria thing, and this is the first deputy perm rep, Dmitry Polyansky. And I had never heard this before. He said, we understand what you Americans are up to. You actually are getting more and more involved in Syria, particularly in the north, in Idlib, and what you're doing is you're going to carve out, you're helping to disintegrate Syria, and what you're going to do is create two Syrias, the bad Syria of Mr. Assad and the good Syria. I'd never heard it put that way, and I thought, wow, I'd like to see how you could pull that off, if that's even possible remotely, but that was his argument. I thought, holy cow. You know a lot more about U.S. policy than I do, because I don't think that's where we're going right now in terms of any more of a direct involvement. If anything, the president recently said, although I don't know how can you say, I don't know how authoritative that is, although he is the president.
You can see that some in Turkey, though, if the Arabism is occurred.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I do find particularly both fascinating and depressing about this war. And I even argue, I think you could have a reasonable debate among really deep, smart experts on Iraq. Does Iraq still actually exist? Isn't it really this collection of three entities? There's the Shia, who are now essentially reigning in Baghdad, but then there's this huge Sunni, fairly large minority that doesn't quite have a role. They don't have authorities. They feel like, this is how we got to ISIS in the first place. I don't know that that's gotten a whole lot better. And then you got the Kurds, who clearly want to leave the ranch. They know exactly what they want. So is it fair to actually say that Iraq really kind of exists right now? Syria, I don't know, maybe that's where we'll end up in Syria. That's a harder call in some ways. And part of it depends on Turkey. If the Kurds could have some kind of self-autonomy in certain ports of the Syrian Kurds, that would be really interesting. And what would that mean for many potentially other enclaves? Because I don't know how you're going to reconcile the Sunnis with Assad. I just can't see that, especially after all the deaths that he's inflicted on so many people. What a cheery outcome. So that's the worst case scenario. So in a worst case scenario, the war continues, no matter what they do in Idlib, there's always going to be some low level of fighting, and over time, what you have is kind of a disintegration a la Libya, where it becomes very regional and local. How do you run the government from Damascus when so many people are opposed to the central government? How do you do governance? Unless it's managed by the locals, in which case, over time, they become a little more autonomous, or a lot more autonomous. Please.
One more. Given that that Trump made that statement about getting out of Syria,
Yes.
and then he's also made statements about Afghanistan and maybe Iraq. Theoretically, what happens if we create that vacuum where we no longer have influence in those hotspots?
Well, in Afghanistan, I'm assuming that there are historians in the audience here. This is a multiple century long problem. The Brits lived through this. The Soviets lived through it. We've lived through it. I think an argument can be made that maybe we don't lose a lot of influence there, but I don't know how much influence we actually have right now. I guess is how I would counter that. I think our bigger problem is Pakistan, actually. Has anybody seen the new Stephen Cole book called Directorate S? It's worth a read. That, to me, there's the Afghan problem, but I think almost the bigger part of the problem is our relationship with the PACs and their inability or unwillingness to deal with their Taliban and these other al-Qaeda-based elements who were still there. And just these fascinating web of really not helpful relationships that the intel service has with these various groups, because their obsession is India. I don't think it's really about Afghanistan, it's about India. So that's one issue. Now, the Iraq thing, I'd like to think that we actually have a stake there. I mean, we certainly invested a lot. I'd like to think that whoever is governing in Baghdad, even if they're Shia, in the Shia-dominated governments we have now, I think even I don't think there's a great love relationship with Iran. I do think there's still a sense of statehood among the government people in Baghdad who understand there's actually some value in continuing to have a relationship with the U.S., if for no other reason than to keep Iran a little bit at bay. I'm not one of those who buys the argument, and some have argued that basically Iraq is increasingly becoming kind of a compliant state, if you will, of Iran because of the Shia role. You could probably have a healthy debate about that. I think the people in government now, at any rate, they're not the PMC people. They're I think, more traditional geopolitical states, people who understand you want to have this balance of relations. And also, for good reason, you can get things from a lot of different. So I do think we have a stake in there in trying to maintain a positive working relationship with the government. Laura?
I have a question about, I think it might fall under your CT point in the region. Can you discuss intel sharing practices between Russia and different regional actors and what they cooperate on, if we know anything?
Yeah, that's a harder one. The Russians, like us, have a whole variety of intelligence relationships with other intel services. I mean, that's not a secret. There have been cases, for example, of the Russian aircraft that was bombed on takeoff from Egypt. This is like 3 years ago in Sinai. I do think that there was some level of intel sharing there, although that was also very political on the part of Egyptians in terms of how they wanted to cast what happened. Because for good domestic political reasons and tourism reasons, they wanted to be clear about what might have happened. I think with the Turks, there's probably some intel sharing going on. This is pure speculation on my part, but because of the Kurdish problem, I have to believe that they're talking about what's going on in the northeast of Syria with the Kurds. We obviously have a relationship, we meaning the U.S. government, we have a relationship with the Russians on CT, although you'd have to talk to the folks at CTC. Sometimes we get some things done, sometimes we don't. But I think any major power that has equities in the Middle East, they probably have some kind of a liaison relationship with some of the key actors. Is that a question?
I'm kind of curious about the situation in northern Syria that we saw with the Kurds and Turks fighting over the city of Afrin and eventually the Turks taking that city. What are the potential Russian stakes in that, and what are potential Russian options moving forward? And I know that at least a couple of weeks ago there was the plan of a meeting in Turkey this April between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And so what could potential outcomes of a meeting between those three be?
So I think I said earlier, so they're meeting tomorrow.
Oh, yes.
The Russians, the Iranians, and the Turks, and they're meeting in Ankara. And I think this is actually going to be probably the #1 agenda item is how are we going to try to work through, and I like the word navigate. How are we going to navigate our respective roles in dealing with this Kurdish challenge in the north? This is one where I think this is one of the risks for the Russians that I was hinting at earlier. This is one of those issues where they're going to be forced to take a stand. I think right now they're trying to stand pretty closely on the side of the Turks. And it also serves Assad's purposes at this point to the extent that you can crush any kind of Syrian Kurdish push for greater autonomy, this serves all of their interests. But at the end of the day, it also means you're going to have to kill or exterminate a huge number of Kurds, which I think is also potentially going to backfire, both in terms of international opinion, potential new terrorist activities aimed at Russian forces, both within Syria but also abroad. These are some of the best fighters. As we know, if you look at the battlefield activity, one of the reasons I think Assad is eager to deal with this is because among all the fighters in the SDF, it's the Kurds who've actually been reportedly the best among the fighters, both in a fight against ISIS, but also against Syrian government forces. So this potentially is going to be a big dilemma for the Russians. How far you want to go in supporting Erdogan and Assad in basically trying to eliminate the Kurds. Somebody else had a question in the back.
Are there any newest policy options when it comes to Russia's proliferation of some of these conventional weapons, like the S-400s or the Onyx anti-ship cruise missiles? Those things going to Iran or Syria can, even though they're conventional weapons, can significantly alter like the strategic calculus in the region. Like, is there anything we can do in that aspect?
I think that we don't have a whole lot of leverage with the Russians right now, in light of the fact that we've imposed such a large number of different sanctions. I think one example where it actually worked for a pretty long time, I think I alluded to the S-300 sale to Iran. We were meeting on the Russians, I think since around 1997. I remember actually doing briefings at the NSC about the ongoing Russian negotiations with Iran on this. And we managed to keep them, to forestall them actually consummating this deal until very recently, like in the last 5 years, and now it's actually starting to come to the implementation phase. So I think because at the time we had equities, we were trying to keep the Russians in a positive relationship, we had a little more leverage. But now, given the really poor state of affairs, I don't know how much we could actually bring to bear on the Russians, on any of these systems. And they generally make the argument these are defensive systems. What's the problem? If you're flying aircraft over Iran territory, well, the poor Iranians have a right to self-defense. What's the problem? Now, I hear you, though. I mean, I'm very sensitive to the implications of this. They're pretty big for us. Any other questions?
Let's thank Peter for these insightful comments.